seminar is just to get us off on a common footing, and it's primarily for the researchers involved in the project, the Kule Research Cluster project on the reform of the government of Ukraine. Envisages, the program is for 3 years, and it envisages an examination of 3 aspects of reforms in the Ukrainian government. And the purpose of the seminar is to identify a series of, identify at least in a tentative way, the research agenda, specify some research problems on which then the actual investigators involved in the project can get to work and begin to produce the papers that they will deliver at the forthcoming conferences, which are scheduled according to a calendar that we drew up. And for those who are not part of the project, this is simply jumping off point, can be a jumping off point for your own independent research on Ukraine, taking into account where Ukraine is aiming for in terms of its democratic reforms, and what the obstacles and opportunities are to take that forward. But before I go ahead with outlining the project in a bit more detail and introducing our main speakers, I'll pass around this sheet of paper and ask everybody to put their name and email address on. If you don't want to disclose your email address, it's fine. You don't have to. It's not compulsory to belong to this group. But on the other hand, if you want to keep in touch with us, then this is an easy way to do that. And while you're doing that, perhaps we can go around the table and each person can introduce themselves so that we know each other, because I think that not everybody knows absolutely everybody else. And in keeping with the turn to the left in the province, I'm going to start on my left with Laurie.
My name is Laurie Thorlakson. I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science, and I'm also the director of the EU Centre of Excellence here on campus.
My name is Emeritus. I'm a project coordinator with the EU Centre of Excellence in Thorlakson.
I'm Oliver Rossier. I'm the Senior Officer of the Arts Collaboration Enterprise, and I'm looking forward to hearing this discussion.
Yeah, I'm Adam Dombovar, and I'm the CIUS coordinator.
I'm Faith Fernald, and I'm a member of the general public, just here for information.
My name is Olenka Milash, and I'm in the Faculty of Education, but I'm also overseeing this project, so I'd just like to welcome everybody to this first of what we hope will be 10 seminar series, and will help to build capacity at the university among faculty and graduate students and the public as well, and that we hope that after the 3-year project we will have a much better understanding in general and be able to more easily communicate about things that are happening with this democratic reform process.
I'm Linda Reed. I'm a professor at the Faculty of Law, and in context of this research project, my areas of research are national human rights institutions, good governance, rule of law.
I'm Eva Revit, and I'm a doctoral student in educational policy studies and interested in governance issues. So, yeah, looking forward to hearing more about it.
I'm Jerry Couture, and I'm in educational policy studies, professor there, and I'm the lead on the post-secondary subcluster on the cluster. So,
I'm Yaris Balan, and I coordinate the Kule Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. I'm interested obviously in contemporary Ukraine, and so I'm just here to learn about what it is you're planning.
My
You're a
name is
spy.
My name is Anna Bisco, retired from the Faculty of Arts and the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and I'm very interested in learning also more about the project. So I guess you could just say I'm public. I'm public interest, I think. Okay.
And I'm Roman Patrician. I'm the director of the Ukrainian Center from MacEwan University, and I'm one of the members that joining Jerry's cluster. We're going to be looking at the reform of the post-secondary system in Ukraine.
I'm David Marples. I'm the chair of the Department of History and Classics and former member of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies.
Very good. And I'm Bohdan Harasymiw. I'm Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Calgary, but they didn't hold it in ASPE, and they asked me to serve as acting coordinator for political and regional studies here at the CIUS. But sort of independently of that, I'm involved with this project with my colleagues Olenka Bilash and Roman Patrician. The project, the Kule Institute for Advanced Study has been very generous with us, and they're giving us a 3-year grant to study democratic reform of government in Ukraine. And we are going to study it under 3 main headings. One is good governance and rule of law, of which this seminar is a component. Well, we'll be talking about that in more detail as the afternoon progresses, so I don't need to emphasize much there, except that, of course, this is a huge effort for Ukraine in light of the background conditions and the lack of action in this regard during the period of independence since 1991. But the idea is to introduce the rule of law, accountability, decentralization of government, which is drastically needed, limitation, at least, if not eradication, of corruption, and what else? Constitutional reform in addition to that, plus changing the electoral laws and everything else. However, for purposes of the project, we are limited. The Ukrainian government has a whole program of reforms that it's intending to implement. We're focusing on just a handful. The other 2 components of the project are, as has already been mentioned around the table, reform of post-secondary education. And so we're going to be looking at the adoption or modification of Western models of university governance in Ukraine, and the struggle over different kinds of models, domestic and foreign. And then the 3rd component of the project, which is directed mostly by Anna Dashkiewska, it has to do with nationalities and language policies. So we really have our plate full of possibilities here, and in order to tackle all these problems, we have tried to draw in talent from the university itself here, but also other academics in Canada and abroad, in Europe and in Ukraine. Once we settle on our main research problems, we will be communicating that to our colleagues abroad and commissioning them to carry out the research, which will be reported and eventually published. So that we will try to assess the project progress that Ukraine is making in these various aspects of these 3 components of the project, and trying to anticipate whether Ukraine ever will reach the ultimate goal, or if it's going to mutate into something not quite what people would like to see. Now, by way of background, I've invited two of my colleagues to give us, on the one hand, the prescription that the EU has for Ukraine in terms of what are the requirements for a proper European democratic country. And I've asked Lori Thorlakson to brief us on that. And then for the historical background, David Marples will fill that in. And then I'll come in last with some details on some specific aspects of the reform process, and some emphasis on why this is important to study. It's important to study because the outcome is totally uncertain. It's not given that Ukraine, just because the EU is so willing to give its thousands of pages of instructions to Ukraine, that it's going to manifest in the desired end result. So, first of all, Lori, please.
Okay, thanks very much. I thought what I would do today is talk a little about the framework of the European international organizations that are active in Ukraine to support and stabilize the country politically and economically, and also in security terms. And then focus a little bit more on the EU and the engagement that it has, because it represents quite a significant involvement. So first of all, in terms of the European organizations that are active in Ukraine, I'm going to talk about three. I'm going to talk about the European Union. I'm going to talk about the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, as well as the Council of Europe. So just roughly, in quite broad terms, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe is it's the world's largest regional security organization, and it operates in Ukraine with a focus in three different areas. First of all, democratization and good governance. Secondly, rule of law and human rights, as well as security issues, and this includes economic, environmental, and political military security issues. It has an expertise in political negotiations, as well as conflict prevention management and post-conflict management. And what's the OSCE's involvement in Ukraine right now, one very important involvement, is the special monitoring mission that it has in place, and it has had in place since March 2014. So if you go online on the OSCE's website, on their Ukraine mission, you'll be able to see daily updates, and they provide daily reports on, they are monitoring the implementation, or non-implementation, as the case may be, of the Minsk agreements. And so their daily reports detail reports of fighting, of internally displaced persons, and protests. And so from these reports, we can see a pretty detailed list of ceasefire violations with the Minsk agreements. And so it operates in Donetsk and Luhansk, and hopefully these reports will help contribute to stopping the inflow of weapons and militants. It at least provides some of the information that can help formulate a response. So that's the OSCE, and the Council of Europe is another important organization. It's the leading human rights organization in Europe, and it's the body that oversees the implementation of the European Convention on Human Rights. And the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg hears complaints of human rights violation. And so right now the Council of Europe has an investigation advisory panel which has been active, gathering information related to human rights violations during the Maidan uprisings. And so they've been looking into, it has a committee on the prevention of torture, which has which has also been investigating correctional colonies in Kharkiv, and it's been reviewing measures taken to prevent abuses by law enforcement against the Maidan protesters. And so we have Council of Europe involved in investigating human rights problems. I'm going to be focusing on what the European Union is doing in Ukraine, and also what the European Union has set out as the milestones that it wants to see in terms of democratic governance and stability. So basically, for the European Union, decades ago, the European Union developed a set of criteria called the Copenhagen criteria, which it applies to any country that wants to join the EU. And so it says to any potential member state, you have to fulfill 3 different criteria: democracy, so rule of law, free and fair elections, commitment to protection of human rights, and the democratic values that are enshrined in the treaties. We can be a little bit cynical about this sometimes and look at some of the current member states of the EU, which are not necessarily completely compliant with this, and Hungary is a good case, and so there's some difficulty with actually enforcing these, but this is the standard that's set out. Democracy. Secondly, prospective members must have a commitment to a market economy, and must undertake third, must undertake the administrative reforms to show that it is capable of implementing the full acquis communautaire, which is the full body of laws and regulations and all of the rules that make up the EU with all of its policies, and especially single market policies, which is a large focus of what the EU does. Now, these are the conditions for membership. Now, to be clear, Ukraine has not been offered a membership perspective by the European Union. This is something that Ukraine wants quite badly, and the Ukrainian ambassador to the EU gave an interview last month in which he said quite clearly Ukraine is waiting for a membership perspective. The EU, in return, has offered Ukraine a package which is sometimes described as everything but institutions. And so under its Eastern Partnership, it's offered it an association agreement coupled with a deep and comprehensive free trade area, which would see Ukraine approximate or adopt the set of EU regulations relating to its single market, in return for giving Ukraine access to the EU market and then providing the EU with access to the market in Ukraine. So there is this agreement and this association agreement, which involves sectoral cooperation and support. It involves this market access and free trade agreement, and really requires Ukraine to take on most of the obligations of membership in return for accessing this market. There's one other key benefit on the table for Ukraine, which is very important to Ukraine, and that is a visa liberalization regime. And this is very valuable to the government of Ukraine. And it's also an area where we see some very promising language, some very positive language coming out of the European Commission, where the Commission has pledged that it will move very proactively and quickly to try to speed up visa liberalization so that people in Ukraine can have visa-free access to the Schengen area. And we shouldn't underestimate the importance of this, although I wonder, and I'm not certain myself, how quickly such liberalization can move in the face of continued lack of security of the eastern border of Ukraine. I don't know how that can happen. But so what we can see is that there are some carrots that are being dangled in front of Ukraine. There are some clear requirements. And if we have a look at some of the reviews that the Commission has undertaken of current developments and reform developments in Ukraine, we get a picture of how the Commission has assessed progress to date in Ukraine and where it is focusing most of its attention. Now, it's not too long ago. So where we are at, we've got this deep and comprehensive free trade area on the table, which is not ratified. The deal in return for securing the Minsk II agreement and ceasefire was to postpone the implementation of the free trade agreement, and so to postpone the EU market access to Ukraine, which is what Russia had pushed for. They did not want the EU to gain this market access to Ukraine because it was a threat to them, and so Russia wanted Ukraine to renegotiate a whole set of this agreement, to renegotiate these tariff lines, and Ukraine refused. But they arrived with this deal in Ireland that led to the Minsk II agreement, which was a bit of a compromise. It was postponing this market access in return for the ceasefire, which Russia then went on to violate. So it's pretty clear that the Russians are not going to make it easy for Ukraine to develop these linkages, these deeper linkages with the EU. So it's really uncertain how that agreement is going to roll forward. I think we can anticipate further Russian roadblocks to that. Russia has made clear that it's not going to allow Ukraine to move easily towards deeper cooperation and partnership with the European Union. So, but nevertheless, the goal of the whole package is to promote stability, boost democracy and governance, and achieve this trade and visa liberalization. If we look at the package that's on the table, in late March, the European Commission announced a package of 1.8 billion euros for what's called a macro financing assistance program for economic and political stabilization and reform. And so this chunk of money, which is quite considerable, it represents the largest package of funds ever given under this MFA program, and it's also the largest ever grant given to a non-EU country. And so I think it's a signal here of the importance that the Commission attaches to this political and economic stabilization on its eastern border. It's part of a larger package of approximately 11 billion euros that has been earmarked by the European Commission over a wide range of programs. Now this 11 billion euros is in addition to funds that will be earmarked by the IMF, the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, as well as the European Investment Bank. So we've got a considerable commitment of funds to help achieve these goals. If we look at where these funds are targeted and where the greatest priorities of the Commission are, far and away, the big ones are economic stabilization, which I believe are quite directly related to the good governance and democratic stabilization, because combating corruption is a huge target of this, and the Commission has identified certain sectors in particularly, and so combating corruption has been linked with liberalization of the gas sector and rolling back subsidies, state subsidies of the gas sector, because this had given rise to huge corruption opportunities in Ukraine. And so you've got a couple of issues tied together. You've got an absolutely unsustainable fiscal situation and sort of huge structural deficits in Ukraine, which, if they continue, will lead to disaster, and you cannot, and it would jeopardize any democratic reforms and governance reforms that roll out if the whole country collapses, because it's financially unsustainable. So rolling back these state subsidies, introducing more transparent ways of managing these finances, and so tracking these payments that are made between municipal and regional governments to these gas companies to trace where the money is going is a key priority. Before the Commission made its decision, the Parliament really made the decision on the macro-financial package, but the Commission proposed this, and when they proposed this, they had conducted a review of where they thought Ukraine was at in terms of its reforms. And the Commission had noted that the program of structural reform implementation that the Ukraine government had committed to was not complete. They noted that it had been interrupted by the 2014 conflict as well as by presidential and parliamentary elections. However, they note that there's been important progress made in energy, banking, public finances, and anti-corruption. Banking reform was quite a high priority for the Commission because the banking sector was in a mess, and Ukraine had undertaken work and were quite successful in eliminating banks that were not viable, reforming the regulatory framework. And so they've conducted stress tests on banks and put 30 out of 180 banks in the country were put into receivership. And I think it's worth thinking about the recent experience in the Eurozone, just to remind ourselves of the connection between big troubles in the banking sector and democracy, because we've seen that as the Eurozone went through crisis, we saw that gave rise to extremist politics and politics of protests. And so I think it's worth reminding ourselves that some of these sectoral reforms are indeed quite key to the governance reforms that are more directly linked to democracy, because these types of double transitions are quite difficult, and so if you can support a smoother economic transition, it paves the way for a more successful democratic transition. Now, the Commission also noted that the government had introduced a new social security scheme to protect the most vulnerable households, and so yet we see additional Commission funding earmarked to protect the most vulnerable in society and to create or to prevent hardship there. So they've also noted that there have been few details on reported plans to overhaul and simplify the tax system. This is important because it's also linked quite directly to corruption problems, so it becomes that's one key area that the Commission has targeted for reform. They've also noted that the government has achieved little reform in public finance management, and so there has been some reform of procurement practices again, which is an area that's pops up right in the middle of battles against corruption, and so that they've noted that there's still a long way to go in reducing corruption in quasi-state enterprises. And I think that, and this really makes me think about the observations made in the article that you circulated, Bohdan, where the authors had noted in the case of Ukraine that in contrast to some of the other countries in the region, we see this incredible hold of the oligarchs, not only in their ownership and control over local industry, but their ownership of politics and of political parties. And so I think that these Commission identified targets of next steps are probably quite on the mark, but they're also going to be quite difficult areas in which to achieve some progress. Now, I would now the European Commission, as I mentioned, it has this 11 billion euro package of projects, and they're aimed at supporting political and economic reforms from all the way from battling corruption to promoting civil society, where actually I think Ukraine is probably not doing too badly. To sector-specific support for reform and development. A few specific comments, and actually I've got a comment about the education property. You may want to look into the programming that the Commission has dedicated under the Erasmus Plus. You probably already looked at that, but there might even be some possibilities for additional funding for the project under that. And it occurred to me that there might be, it might be interesting for this project to have a look at the Commission initiatives on civil society, if that were an area that the team wanted to look at more closely. There's 10 million euros allocated to support for civil society in this package of support.
Very good, thank you very much. Are there any observations or questions or interventions? No?
Useful overview.
Clarification needed? No?
Maybe I could just put
sure.
one
No,
brief question just to start the discussion. So as I understand it, the Russian Federation has attempted to slow down or derail the negotiations, but seems to not to be having much success. Is that a fair reading?
I don't know, because I don't know what's coming up next. I think that Russia's stepped in at every opportunity to be obstructive, and so in the OSCE mission, they've stepped in and they've said no OSCE in Crimea, for instance, and the Americans are opposed to that and pushing back against it. The Russians have made it clear that they, and I think we've learned the hard way, that they are not going to let former Soviet states choose their own way in the region. And I think that it just introduces a lot of unpredictability. And the great difficulty is that Russia has the power to derail some of the most attractive incentives toward reform. And I think there are going to be pretty strong incentives needed. Because if we draw, for example, on the research that's been done into transitions in the post-communist states in Central Europe, for instance, one of the lessons that's typically drawn is that we can look at paths of democratic reform and the effectiveness of EU conditionality, and so these promises that are and treats dangled before these countries. And some countries have responded quite positively and have undertaken successful and rather rapid paths of democratic reforms in response. Others have not and have persisted along a more authoritarian path. And one of the explanations that has been used for the situation is a rational one, and it's one that's looked at the costs that are facing the local leaders. And so if your costs of adjustment in order to meet these requirements that the EU sets out are far too great for you and maybe exceed those potential benefits, then you're not going to reform. And so this explains the slower pace of democratic transition in the Western Balkans, for instance. And if your politics are highly nationalist, you've got a lot to lose from shifting away from that type of competition. If meeting the terms of conditionality means you might have to go to prison yourself or jail members of your party, that's a pretty high cost. So if we look at the situation in Ukraine, you have oligarchs there, and especially in some parts of the country, who have a lot to gain either from not reforming, or even more dangerous is from undertaking partial reforms. You reform partially, you capture the benefits, and then you prevent any further change from taking place. So that's a big risk, and especially if Russia is certainly in a position to ensure that some of these oligarchs continue to benefit from Russian influence. And the Russians have shown us already that they are able to diminish the value of these promises. Access to the EU market, well, they've shown us that they can derail that. So this to me is the external factor is a huge complication here, and I think it's really unpredictable. David probably knows a lot more about what we can predict about these external factors.
Okay, well, that seems to be a convenient point at which to turn it over to David.
Okay, so what I've done is, first of all, provided just a brief background overview, and then look at the immediate results of Euromaidan, and then to talk about the focus of the new government, where I'm going to make its main emphasis. And then I've just got a little bit on why the reforms might succeed and why they might fail. And I think the question why democratic reforms in Ukraine to date have not been successful could be divided into short and long term, and some that have continued throughout the independence period. In the long term, Ukraine first established its constitution back in 1996, but it was amended many times. There were numerous reform plans at the end of the Soviet period. There were many that involved Western agencies like the Renaissance Foundation, administrative legal reform initiatives, and probably failed mainly because of the economic climate, a period of severe recession, and perhaps over-ambition as to what could be achieved in a short time. By the mid-1990s, there was a significant division of Ukraine's natural resources and assets. If anyone can remember that far back, in the mid-1990s, Lazarenko, in his brief tenure as the Prime Minister of Ukraine, typified one of the worst times for corruption in the Ukrainian economy. The period of Leonid Kuchma as president, which went on for 10 years, began quite well, but the country became mired in political disputes and a struggle for power between parliament and presidency. And the corruption began to develop in several key areas, such as the courts, higher education. Ukraine only joined the Bologna process in 2005, parliament, and business. And Laurie already mentioned the term oligarch. The oligarchic system was more or less perfected by the end of the 20th century, meaning that state assets were distributed into the hands of a relatively few, quote-unquote, businessmen, many with ties either to the president or government, ties to the former Communist Party, and local clans in cities like Dnipropetrovsk and Donetsk, which in turn were bitter rivals. And the Ukrainian oligarchs should be kept quite separate from the Russian oligarchs. They were able to build their own individual empires, and they were quite resistant to outside influences. An example of their continuing survival is the case of Dmitro Firtash, whom the United States just failed to extradite from Austria, and despite the efforts of Yushchenko, Timoshenko, and others to deal with him. The Orange Revolution at the end of 2004 came about partly because of a response to corruption, partly a revolt against excessive Russian influence over Viktor Yanukovych, presidential candidate, and provided great hope for future reforms. They were dissipated by a poor president and internal wrangling. But also the European Union at that time did not open its doors to Ukraine despite the appeals of the new president, and left the new government somewhat floundering after the success of the demonstrations. There was also the failure to bring to a complete process, bring to trial those accused of corruption. Ultimately, after the dismissal of Prime Minister Timoshenko, Yanukovych returned to the political elite as Prime Minister of Ukraine, this time under Yushchenko. And by 2010, the Ukrainian leadership had been completely discredited. But the following period was even worse in terms of reforms. There were certain amendments to the constitution introduced in 2004. These were removed by Yanukovych. The president gained more authority. The courts were run by his personal appointees, and decision-making was geared to his needs, so that there were many documented cases of abuses of a judicial procedure. In other words, there was no separation between the judicial powers and the political authorities. And abuses of power saw politically motivated arrests of the personal enemies of the president, such as Timoshenko and the Interior Minister Yuri Lutsenko. As for the results of Euromaidan, no part of Ukraine was really left untouched by these protests. And they were interspersed with extreme actions, especially by the government, to reverse the situation, such as the draconian laws of January 2014 that would have allowed the government to rule by emergency decree. But the removal of Yanukovych created a new situation. Ukraine rejected the overtures of the European foreign ministers to act as intermediaries, removed the president, and created a new parliament that excluded both communist and regions deputies. And simultaneously, occupation of Crimea by Russia changed the situation further, and the subsequent conflict in the Donbass severed parts of that region from the rest of Ukraine, impeding or preventing its participation in elections and other processes. And the two Minsk agreements that were mentioned by Laurie in September 2014 and February 2015, above all else, perhaps, provided some recognition to the two separatist regimes called the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. The new parliament, after 25th of August 2014, transformed the legislature from one dominated by the regions to one controlled firmly by the parties of the President and Prime Minister and others who supported the Euromaidan protests. Altogether, they control over 300 seats in a 450-seat assembly. The opposition bloc has just 40, and 43 deputies have no affiliation. All the deputy factions except one are completely new. Svoboda, which got over 10% in the 2012 elections, no longer has a presence and has been largely usurped by the radical party of Oleg Lyashko. The only party that's still there from the old time is Batkivshchina, formerly the main opposition party under Yanukovych, which went down from 101 seats to 19, so very small. Actually, it's a bit like our Conservative Party today. Focus of the new parliament has been to create distance between itself and the previous regime in a number of ways, and I'll briefly comment on three, which I think are all related to this project. Lustration, meaning the cleansing of power strategy, based on the previous governments of the former Warsaw Pact in the 1990s, and which involves all facets of government reforms, such as economic and judicial, citizenship laws, and orientation towards the EU. Second, the new economic reform program introduced in December by Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk. And then, more recently, the decommunization laws, which seek to ban communist and national symbols and monuments, and recognize the contribution to Ukrainian independence of all those who actually fought for it during the 20th century. The Parliament of Ukraine introduced two lustration bills in 2014 in April and December. The first was to restore confidence in the legal system of Ukraine, and its most obvious immediate result was the removal of over 300 judges. The second decree made Supreme Court judges of Ukraine liable to lustration. The Council of Europe has had some comments on these laws, as well as has its advisory body, the Venice Commission, because of the possibility that they may assume guilt and the extent to which the crimes of the accused can actually be verified. And I think a brief way to summarize that would be to say that whereas it may be justifiable to bring to task some of the justices of the Yanukovych era, extension of the decrees into the communist past might take the form of a vendetta, and one without any foreseeable end. And I think Poland's already had that same problem. Thus, the Council of Europe has suggested time limits for lustration and assessments of the authentic threats that are posed by former communist officials. As for the economic reforms, they were preceded by the appointment of 3 foreigners to the new government of Ukraine, with responsibility for at least some of them. Natalia Yaresko, the finance minister from the United States. Well, she wasn't US finance minister, but she came, sent a business degree from Harvard. Alvaras Abramovačius, the minister of economic development and trade from Lithuania, also trained in the United States. And Alexander I can't say Georgian names, but Viashvili as the Minister of Health, obviously from Georgia. At the same time, Prime Minister Yatsenyuk introduced a government reform program for 2015-16, which started by removing 10% of state employees and the gradual reduction of income tax from 40%, around 40%, to about 15%. The idea being that if your income tax is lower, there's no need to hide what you've earned. You can actually put it back into the economy. Eventually, Ukrainian citizens will even have to declare their annual income, which I think is outrageous, and many of them will object to that. There's also a proposal to privatize 1,200 or 1,500 state-owned factories, which previously were not on the market. And maybe most significant of all, the establishment of 2 enterprises to look after natural gas transit and storage. And in those enterprises, 49% of the shares will be sold to investors from the United States and the European Union. I don't know what we did wrong in Canada not to get involved in this, but Canada is not included in that. And there's a proposal also for the energy system of Ukraine to be taken out of the Russian orbit and moved into that of the EU, along with the completion of 2 nuclear power reactors at the Khmelnytsky atomic power station in western part of Ukraine, which will come online in 2018, along with the expansion of other atomic power stations in Ukraine. Currently, nuclear power makes up about 40% of electricity in Ukraine. It may expand to about 60%. The problem, of course, is that reactors in the past have been made in Russia, and most of the uranium has come, well, some from Ukraine as well. Also in this package is an idea of stopping the central and bureaucratic government control by reducing the number of state-controlled agencies by half, from 56 to 28, and then reducing the role of state officials and switching gradually to quote-unquote EU standards, and to do that by 2016, which is a pretty tall order. And even the tax, which was mentioned by Laurie as well, is to gradually devolve from the central government to local governments. The judicial system is still a big problem, so the plan is for all judges of Ukraine to go through some kind of requalification before taking up their positions, and the elevation to the Supreme Court as the highest court of Ukraine. In March, the IMF approved a grant of 17.5 billion to Ukraine over the next 4 years to attain economic and financial stabilization, with a further 7.5 billion to come. It's a short-term program, and it makes the assumption that the entrenched post-Soviet bureaucracy can be completely dismantled, which isn't entirely clear. And lastly, the decommunization laws of April the 9th were 4 laws that attempted to outlaw things like communist flags. Unfortunately, in my notes I wrote communist fags, but that's it. Monuments, symbols, to change the names of the cities that have got Soviet names, and there are hundreds of them in Ukraine if you take cities and villages, starting with obvious ones like Dnipropetrovsk and Dniprodzerzhinsk, and to recognize the contribution of builders of Ukrainian statehood and make it an offense to denigrate heroes. The laws are controversial and continue to generate wide discussion in both Ukraine and outside. There is a fear in some quarters that the law will limit historical scholarship, especially on controversial topics like OUN and UPA, the anti-Soviet organizations of the 30s and 40s, and caused deep resentment in the past in countries like Poland. The question might be asked, why introduce such laws now, immediately after such an ambitious reform program has been announced? In fact, I think they're considered part of the same process. Ukraine, in the view of its new leaders, cannot move forward without severing all the links with the past. So the entire Soviet period has been dismissed as a time of tyranny. Even eras when significant progress was made in national and cultural development, such as the 1920s, part of the 1960s, and the late 1980s. The laws haven't been signed by the president yet. There was some discussion and amendments, but he has until May the 15th to sign them, or to decide whether or not to sign them. As you can probably know, that's on Friday, so it's coming up pretty quickly. And lastly, some imponderables. The reform program also coincides with a period of conflict in the east that is continuing and regularly threatens to break into full-scale warfare again. Putin's recent meetings with Angela Merkel and John Kerry suggest that he's open to dialogue. Conversely, it also suggests that Western leaders see no alternative but to communicate with him, which in turn indicates a lack of complete commitment to the Ukrainian cause. The Russian leader, I think, is not planning a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, at least not yet, but he remains determined to limit the activities of the post-Euromaidan government in any way possible including backing the separatist regimes in the Donbass. How long can Ukraine keep Donbass? And I guess the other question is, does it need to? And why would the reforms be successful in 2015 and not earlier? What is so different? Well, I thought of 4 positive factors. First, the departure of the communists and the regions parties from the parliament. Second, the personality of the president, who is an oligarch himself by any standards, but he's happy to go along with most of the reforms. I think, by the way, he was talking about selling his chocolate factories for some astronomical sum the other day, so he doesn't intend to come out of this poverty streak. Third, an alignment of forces on the centre-right in the governing coalition, with party and leaders committed to the same goals. And fourth, the support of the IMF and the EU financially and materially. And lastly, why might these reforms not succeed? Well, as Laurie mentioned, the economic situation is quite perilous. The GDP declined by 6.8% last year and is projected to decline a further 7.5% this year. Standard & Poor has lowered Ukraine's credit rating to CCC+, which is pretty low, and has stated that default on foreign currency central government debt is, quote, a certainty, after which the rating will be lowered to a D. And a quotation from this same statement was that the Ukrainian Ministry of Finance's debt operation is guided by the following objectives: to generate $15 billion in public sector financing during the program period. Second, bring the publicly guaranteed debt to GDP ratio under 71% of GDP by 2020. And third, to keep the budget's gross financing needs at an average of 10% of GDP, with an absolute maximum of 12% of GDP annually in 2019 to 25. Second factor why the reforms might fail is the failure to secure political stability. It includes, on the one hand, the separatist regimes in the east that have no interest in working with the Ukrainian government, and on the other hand, volunteer military battalions that have conducted much of the defense of Ukraine, but remain dissatisfied with the regular army leadership and even the government in Kiev. The Minsk agreements, with their change of status to give political autonomy to Donetsk and Luhansk republics, requires the approval of Parliament, which is unlikely to be forthcoming, and therefore there will be a period of further stalemate. The role of Putin is the third factor, and the Putin leadership. As noted, it wishes to destabilize Ukraine and create, at minimum, a frozen conflict in the Donbass, one of the most important industrial zones of Ukraine in the past. And of course the Russian argument is not that Ukraine should not be free to decide for itself, but that the Americans are dictating what Ukraine is doing and trying to move Ukraine out of the Russian orbit and into theirs, with future NATO membership down the line. And fourth, opposition within the government itself. There's been some resentment, incidentally, about the appointment of the 3 foreigners to the 3 ministries, and I guess similar comments could be made about our own program, really. We're getting Western funding to bring government reform to Ukraine. Certainly Ukrainian leaders and what might be termed the intellectual elite are extremely sensitive to critiques from outside the country. And fifth, the commitment of EU to Ukraine, which Laurie has discussed in depth, may not be as monolithic as appears, in that some countries in the EU seem to be more ambivalent and not totally committed. Germany, for example, wants to keep lines to Russia open under any circumstances. So it's very important, in my view, for Ukraine to get through the next 2 years. And to do so, some compromise may be needed, as well as an understanding that there may be some wisdom to proceeding slowly, rather than at the sort of breakneck pace that the Prime Minister seems to want. So I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you very much, David. All right, any immediate reactions there, questions?
Proceeding slowly, do you mean like another 20 years?
No, not that fast, but I think in terms of how fast, let's say, to end corruption in Ukraine, or lustration process.
Just bring it to Italian or French levels, that would be big steps. Well, you didn't say anything about in all of this, I mean, you talk about Russia, EU and everything, but what about ordinary Ukrainians? I mean, they're the ones who drove the Maidan, and that they are playing a role in driving Ukrainian politics and determining its future.
Well, Euromaidan, I think, received a very mixed response. I mean, surveys suggested it was about 50-50 in terms of support and opposition among the population. I think that the groups that were supporting it are well represented in Parliament. So in a way, the population has got something that it asked for. It's got representation, which it hasn't had in the past. In the East, I think it's less clear what people have got. I mean, there are huge regions of Donetsk and Luhansk that are still under the Ukrainian government control, but they regard the government as somewhat alien and not really interested in helping them, and resent the bombing of their homes in the anti-terrorist operation and things like that. I think the population, to some extent, is a little impatient and wants rapid changes, but I don't see any other way to reform other than the program that's been outlined. It seems to me the best way to go, the only conceivable way to go, if you want to get out of this massive debt. You cannot go the Russian route anymore, because the Russian route comes with very serious conditions entailed. So I think Ukraine had to make that choice. It couldn't combine as Kuchma used to do, and sort of stick one foot in one camp and one camp in the other. That's no longer feasible. It was feasible under Yeltsin. It's not feasible under Putin. And I think any sensible person in Ukraine realizes that now.
There's an article interviewing Vikeshkina, the sociologist, at the end of April in Ukrainian Week, and she's reporting that those in quotes centers surveys show decreased willingness of people to suffer more from the reforms. But she, in the survey, and she in her article have in mind the economic reforms rather than the political reforms. So, okay, there aren't any other points at this time. Maybe on the project, and this portion of the project is concerned instituting the rule of law, decentralization of government, introduction of accountability, and curbing corruption. From the Ukrainian perspective, it means turning the whole political system upside down. Because in the Soviet era, it was a command administrative system, highly centralized, with no accountability or transparency, and certainly no rule of law. Law was an instrument of the rulers. In the post-Soviet era, instead of reforms were postponed for various reasons, and some of them are explained in Andrew Wilson's book. There were opportunities for populist appeals and so on, and those were the concern of the politicians more than actually implementing reforms. And there were some economic good times that allowed the rulers to shunt reforms aside. But so that meant that this highly centralized political system continued. The privatization of some of the economic and political power went on, and a very abnormal kind of political system developed. in which it was neither fish nor fowl. Now, in the wake of the Revolution of Dignity, or the Euromaidan Revolution, President Poroshenko and the government of Prime Minister Yatsenyuk have embarked in earnest on a program of reform, and they've put out some documents last fall, recovery plan for Ukraine, action plan, and it covers the whole spectrum. It's extremely ambitious in regards to those things that are of concern to us. The action plan lists decentralization, good governance, combating corruption, and reform of the judiciary, and has specific objectives, creating a three-level structure of government instead of what they had in the past, with the president appointing the very lowest level officials in the whole country, thousands and thousands of them, to illustrate the point that it was so highly centralized. Allocating taxes and duties, instituting local taxes and duties so that the local governments will have ways of financing themselves. 60% of the income tax of natural persons and 10% of the income tax of companies, which flow to the central government, will go to the local governments. And to stimulate the enlargement of the territorial communities, support their voluntary mergers through adopting a legislative framework. Basically, when you read that part of their program and their intentions, they want the local communities to be business friendly and to stimulate enterprises and entrepreneurial activity so as to create the money to provide the services at the local level. In the area of good governance, cutting the number of state officials. I think David mentioned already that the target of 10% of the public service is going to be dismissed. Reforming administrative services, mapping the structure and function of government to eliminate duplication, and implementing various improvements such as hiring people by competition rather than other ways. Combating corruption, a series of measures there, reforming the judiciary, and there are target dates. Actually, the target dates are by the end of 2014, but it hasn't happened yet, so obviously there's more work to do, and there is a reason for our existence, that is to map when they might finally reach those objectives. So our project aims to assess the chances of success in this effort. And why is it important? It just seems obvious to people who are following political events in Ukraine because of legitimacy and stability, and in the absence of that legitimacy or loss of that legitimacy, then there will be more instability and more revolutions, complete or incomplete as they've been in the past. Anyway, it's critical, but the question for the country to do these reforms, but will it realistically happen? The outcome is uncertain, and hence a good reason for academics to study. This is a so the whole effort is problematical. We have to look at the government's objectives and plans and assess whether they're realistic in light of the present conditions, in light of the inertia, and there's lots of that, and we have to determine what is a success going to depend on. Will it be a simple matter of passing the law? Obviously not. they have to be implemented, and what are the chances of the required laws being actually implemented as intended. What's been achieved so far? How has it been achieved? To look at what are the factors responsible for success and for the obstacles. What are the reasons to be optimistic or skeptical, as David is and has shown us. I should just mention a few of my own preliminary thoughts from looking at the reports about the various aspects of democratic reform on the Constitution. There was a very interesting article comparing the fate of the Constitution, or the role played by, or the part played by the Constitution in Poland and in Ukraine, and that as part of the overall scenario, which has helped to make Poland a success story and Ukraine not so much so. The main point there is the big difference there is that in the period of independence, despite their political differences, the Polish presidents and prime ministers and parliaments have observed the rules. Once they've set them into the new constitution, then they've abided by them, even if they didn't agree, for their own political purposes, with what the outcome was going to be. In the Ukrainian case, you have two of the main presidents, Kuchma and Yanukovych, who deliberately disregarded the constitution and went ahead with efforts to make sure that their preferences prevail. So with this kind of use, political use of the Constitution as a background, Ukraine doesn't have a very good track record in terms of what the future might hold, because the pattern has been set for the president to disregard the rules. In the area of decentralization, the Ukrainians are getting their advice and trying to follow the pattern of the Scandinavian countries as to decentralization, and so it's not as though they're trying to invent something new, but they have the templates there. An interesting point here is that the government is planning to decentralize powers to the localities, to the communities as they're calling them, but not police functions. So policing is still going to be a national responsibility. That's problematical because that hasn't been fully reformed, although they've called in a Georgian specialist to reform the Georgian police to help as the deputy minister to reform the Ukrainian police. On the judiciary and law enforcement, there are several institutions here, and the outlook is still a bit murky as to whether they will achieve the desired objectives. There are the courts, and the courts themselves are very resistant to change. So the new ways of appointing judges can be legislated by the government, but it's going to take a while to change the habits of the judges. The police. Policing is in need of reform. Some cosmetic changes have been made, but that hasn't happened entirely. The prosecutor's office, its powers are being clipped. It was a kind of a state within the state in the Soviet era, and in the period of independence, the prosecutor's office was used by the president as a weapon to punish his opponents. So that has to change, but the prosecutor's office is itself resisting this. So you can't very well ask the institutions that need reform to reform themselves, because they're not going to of their own accord. So that it's very, very difficult. And then there's the security service, that too needs to be reformed, but some steps are being taken to reduce its size, to introduce some lustration there, and so on. On elections and accountability, this is a problematical area because of the way elections were administered and contested in the period of independence. The administration of the elections was such that it allowed the governing government, the governing party, to manipulate the results, even though they might seem to be free and open. And as far as accountability was concerned, there are great problems because of the party system that developed in the period of independence. The parties themselves, when they ran, had very little difference amongst themselves in terms of their programs, so that you don't have a neat ideological or other distinction between the parties, and in any case, once the parties, besides which, many parties were created to draw off support from the opposition by the government. So it was the electoral competitions were not totally genuine fully. Then there was a further problem, and this plagued the country throughout the period of independence. Once the parliamentary deputies, as they're called there, were elected, they didn't stick with their party. They moved over. Why? Because they would be bribed by the government party to move over. So the complexion of the parliament bore no relationship to the result of the election. And so how can a public
Sounds a bit like an Alberta.
Yes. How can a public hold its representatives accountable when it's not recognizable after when the parliament isn't recognizable after the election? And then there are problems of anti-corruption, lustration. So there are many. There's no shortage of problems to choose from, and there are no shortage of approaches. One of the and our incentive, part of our incentive is that there are varying assessments by informed people as to the success, relative success of the reforms. Some people say the whole year has been wasted. Some say there has been some progress, so this needs specification. And there's no shortage of approaches. We could approach by looking at leadership styles, the relationship between president, premier, and parliament, for example, and how that's developing, and whether it's any different than it was before the Euromaidan revolution. We can look at specific institutions like the Procuracy, or like the security service, or like the police. We could look at overall social dynamics, as the authors of the Problems of Communism article did. That is, the polarization or division in society as a condition which promotes or retards these reforms. Our colleagues in Ukraine can conduct interviews with the principal actors, or they can conduct surveys. Otherwise, people can analyze government documents. So there's a numerous problems, numerous approaches possible. And I think maybe our task, if we can in the time remaining to identify some of the main problems that we can suggest to our team of investigators, and perhaps some thoughts about approaches. So, thank you very much. So it's open to discussion. That's really the next item on our agenda. Thoughts? Yes.
I just wonder, and
Yes.
forgive my ignorance, but I'm wondering about the opportunity engagement points for Canadian or even Canadian Albertan, knowledge transfer or exploration. So, for example, you're talking about the need for advising for the police systems. Well, the RCMP in other times, in other locations, have gone in, or a bit, or I'm not sure whether invited in or how these things start. But RCMP have been advisors around the world, and I don't know whether it's a time in our history where Canada isn't really acting in that way. But another one is, constitutional and legal advice. This is, Canada has been in the past called on and drawn on. I know we sent a lot of advisors to watch the elections, but and then the post-secondary education, like whether there are those, are there any of those areas that have kind of opportunities for Canadian, Ukrainian direct interaction, and then the agricultural research collaboration. So I'm just tossing that all out. I know that's on some level.
Yes, there's just been an announcement by the Canadian government about some forms of aid of this sort. I can't recall the specifics, whether it includes policing, rule of law, constitution, those kinds of things. And maybe somebody remembers the recent press release from the federal government. But yes, there have been there's an ongoing Canadian assistance to the Ukrainian government in various respects. As far as Constitution is concerned, Canadian and North American specialists helped out with the design of the Ukrainian Constitution of 1996, but it has to be remembered that not all of this advice was followed, because in Ukraine, in this post-communist period of transition, politics was not so much about ideologies and programs and who was going to do what and who promised what to the general public. It was a power struggle, and the Constitution itself is the product of a power struggle between the parliamentarians amongst themselves and collectively against the president. And under pressure from him, they finally adopted it because they didn't want him to take it out of their hands. So it's not an ideal document, and as I say, it probably doesn't incorporate all of the good advice that we were giving them. So that's the story on that side. On education, I don't know quite what to say there. Jerry?
I'll just give a sense of how we've been thinking about the educational aspect, and we kind of have developed two component parts. One is an Alberta component, and one is a Ukraine component. And Roman kind of leads the Ukraine side, and I kind of lead the Canadian side. And we've developed people with the kind of an approach that we're looking at two aspects, and one is a kind of participation and implementation, a collaboration, sharing is what you're talking about, as well as doing research on the dynamic. So I'm more committed to the research on the dynamic, but I know others may be more committed to the actual process and the dynamic. And David mentioned, well, then how much are we linked into the the imperial project of the EU or the Americans in this dynamic as researchers? And so this makes it for a very complicated question that you're asking in terms of this particular historical juncture, because it's very fluid. Just even from the last year alone, it's been very fluid, and who can anticipate what will it be in the next year? So we're going with these reforms as they've been initiated in a kind of an ideal model with templates in different places to do it, but it really is mixed into the hardball politics that's going on at the same time. It's unpredictable. But I think there is space in the post-secondary side for involvement. We're hoping that in our conferences that we have this kind of sharing going on, so the actual collaborators themselves are also researchers on both sides of the equation.
Yeah, I mean, education is not the field I study, but I did see a comment the other day about the reform process in education, and the idea then being that, somewhat in line with the Bologna process, to follow the Western example of cutting down dramatically on the number of humanities courses offered in post-secondary education. I mean, this is an aspect of our own system that I dislike intensely. So it would be unfortunate.
So yeah, we're implicated in, for some of us as researchers, in one hand, if we're not careful with promoting and pushing a system that we ourselves are disagreeing with it being pushed upon us here. So that's another. That's very accurate. Yeah, what I've talked about and we've talked about before in the group on is the kind of multiple levels of revolution here. So you're getting this neoliberal revolution with the higher post-secondary education at the very time when neoliberal revolution here in North America is meeting a lot of resistance from the people involved in it. Just that was one example, the reduction on the humanities. At the same time, Roman is, very knowledgeable in that what I would call path dependency. This seems to be what's ignored, that there is this strong, in my own analysis of the historical sociology, you can't ignore the pre-existing political, cultural, institutional apparatuses, the ongoing history, let's say, of the Soviet education system as it was, as necessarily a bad thing, because it's very utopian and risky then to just move forward and say you're going to abolish all that and move ahead, because we know that pragmatically that doesn't work anywhere, at least for people working within the paradigm that I go. You have to almost start working with the actual institutions that are there and see how it's possible to modify them and in fact identify what has been highly successful and we may have even lost already here in some of the neoliberalizing tendencies in our universities. So yeah, we've been trying to formulate a kind of a way to look at kind of multiple directions, and that's another one. Yeah.
Yes.
I would just add, you have
Linda.
to be very careful in the law area as well in terms of advisors from Canada, U.S., other Western countries going in to provide suggestions on legal reform. There's been a lot of criticism about this law and development movement that a lot of experts in the area will just say, well, do what we do, when there are very different legal systems and the different political and democratic and cultural kind of historical contexts. So it becomes very complex to have to work over a longer term closely with people in the region, in the country, and so on. Right? So you don't just transplant something that's non-transplantable and won't have success in the future.
But surely rule of law principles can be adapted to those local conditions.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean,
right.
whatever their legal
Good
traditions
governance.
are, the point is that everybody has to be under the law. And then when you see it being broken, you publicize it and emphasize that, that they're not. And that's just something they have to, even within, in terms of their own legal system, they need to get away from.
Yeah, I mean, there are differences of opinion on what is the rule of law, right? And these thick and thin kind of ideas of the rule of law, because Chinese government would say we have the rule of law, but we might not agree with them, right? The thin versus the thick.
Falun Gong wouldn't.
Yeah, what comprises rule of law? But yeah, I mean, it's when you're looking at, well, how do you reform the tax laws, right? How do you create, what's the structure of new laws, new institutions?
Well,
You have to be very careful about
in the
creating.
in the Ukrainian case, you can start with some kind of course indicators like no more telephone justice. You know, with the local political boss phoning the judge and saying, "This is the sentence you'll hand down to that character."
Yeah. I mean, but it's interesting to me to hear all these Americans going in, or people with American legal training going into Ukraine, because I think the tendency will be that they will have conceptions of U.S. law and institutions that are very different from Canada, are very different from European Union countries, right?
Like gun control. Sorry.
Yeah, I mentioned that. We can think of a lot of examples.
One aspect of the EU's engagement with Ukraine, because they definitely and very deliberately want Ukraine to do as we do, and so part of that engagement is in developing dialogue. So at summit level, at ministerial level, among parliamentarians and delegations in the EU, as well as in the whole Eastern Partnership area, and then dialogues among civil society groups. They want to get that dialogue started, and it's a tool for norm diffusion and soft power, which is a tool that's been pretty effective in the European Union. So I think that's an interesting dimension, just to consider how that gradually shapes some new community of norms over time.
And there may be international norms, right? This is the way around it in certain respects, right? There's been an
They're pushing this. They're saying, you sign up to this and do it exactly like this.
I think one thing that the U of A, I would say, and a lot of academics who've been involved in international work for a number of decades have learned is the importance of, let's say, a cultural broker. And what I think that really involves is a kind of relationship and engagement that makes sure that we're not just giving advice based on our system, but we're in fact really trying to get to understand their system and recognize where there might be parallels. So that something, for example, and I know this from the work I've done in many countries, we hear a Department of Culture and we think, oh, well, that would be our Minister of Culture. And then we just discover that their Department of Culture has nothing to do with the things that we look at. And so that's where a cultural broker comes in. And I think in addition to having really informed scholars on this project, our goal is to continue to involve people from Ukraine so that we're constantly engaging and making sure that even if the language has to change from how we might directly translate it, it's changing in the direction of something that is more democratic.
One question that's raised in one of the articles I read is the reform process in Ukraine really a threat to Putin? And I would ask David for his impression, because this is often thrown out as
well, yeah. I mean, it would be considered a threat to Putin. I don't think it's a threat to Russia, but it's a threat to the Russian regime under Putin. I mean, I think the same thing has been tried to some extent in Russia, in some areas, not in others. Especially in the late 80s, early 90s, when there was real hope that Russia might actually take a more democratic path. But I think as far as this particular regime in Russia is concerned, anything that will take Ukraine out of the Russian orbit, into the European one, into the American one, is considered a threat. And will continue to be that way as well. I mean, there are.
So, do you think one of our researchers should look at that?
The threat from Russia.
Yeah. I mean, if Russia won't allow this to happen, then we may as well forget about the whole project.
Well, it's kind of taken as a given, right? I mean, if Russia was involved in the same kind of process.
I suppose my question is, what leverage does Russia have and not have? I guess. In terms of these reforms.
Well, it has economic leverage insofar as.
But as far as say decentralization of government. We wouldn't have.
Well, it's pushed for federalization in the
Mhm.
East, right?
Mhm.
You put that forward from the very
Yeah,
beginning.
yeah.
And in fact, the Donbass region is the only part of Ukraine that is not on board, if you like,
Yeah.
with the changes at all.
Yeah.
And Russia has influence there, and I think it wants to keep influence there. And it's not allowed these governments to fall. They would have fallen last summer without Russia. There's no question about that. So Putin is hanging on by his fingernails, basically, in terms of Ukraine. He may seem very powerful, but the Russian economy is a shadow of what it used to be. But what would be a converse way of looking at that question would be to, ask Laurie to what extent EU-Russian relations are still making progress, or whether they're being completely abandoned. Because if Russia is part of the EU process as well, then that simplifies things for Ukraine.
Well, the British election has just thrown a huge roadblock into this, because the EU now is going to be sidetracked for the next 2 years waiting for this 2017 referendum on whether or not the UK wants to leave. And then add to that the continuing Greek drama bubbling along the side. It's left the EU in quite a weak position, so it doesn't have a strong, united, and as David mentioned before, there's not everyone has the same idea about how to deal with Putin. So that I do see that as a problem. I mean, out of the list of reforms that you talked about, one thing that I find interesting are these proposals for decentralization. And it seems to me that if you have weakly embedded norms of rule of law, as well as strongly regionally entrenched oligarchs, then decentralization could be a recipe for disaster and for further corruption. There's a researcher, Daniel Treisman, who's also an expert on Russia, but he's written an excellent book on decentralization where he points out some of these pitfalls of decentralization, and corruption is one of them. And I think it makes me wonder if this plan was one of the plans raised by the important advisors who said, well, this works great in the United States and it's protected freedom for us, so let's bring it in here. And I think that would be an interesting one to track, because there are so many ways in which decentralization can lead to unintended consequences and really go off the rails.
But they're using the Scandinavian experience.
But the Scandinavians had a much different starting point when they...
And so did Poland. I mean, incidentally, you made that analogy with Poland, but I think Poland was way ahead of Ukraine to begin with. It was never part of the Soviet system. And didn't have the same pitfalls of having an economy that was completely tied to its neighbour. Yeah. So I don't think it's really comparable to what happened in Europe. But I was going to mention that, I mean, the other aspect of this whole question is military security. And the question whether military security should take precedence over economic reform. Because how can you reform if your entire state is in flux and you don't know whether you're going to survive another 6 months? And military security could only be achieved by drastically cutting off these breakaway regions completely, in my view. Forget about Crimea, forget about Donbass. Consolidate the rest. If Ukraine could join NATO in a kind of truncated form without these two regions, to me that would be a good starting point. Because then you would have some kind of military security. And I think NATO is beefing up resources now to the extent where it would be prepared to do that. And if there was a referendum in Ukraine on joining NATO, it would be really close. Really close. In fact, it may even be in favour now.
Yes.
Whereas in the past it was like 30-70.
Yes.
So that situation is
President Poroshenko has emphasized that earlier, that the number one priority is military security. Secondly, he just recently, the other day, made a statement that he wants Ukraine to become one of the world's #1 arms producers.
Top 5, I think.
Yeah, top 5.
Well, if that's true, then he needs French advisors, not American.
Maybe we should stick to chocolate.
So I guess my point is just that they're very, very aware of it, and it comes out in the government documents. Okay, anybody who hasn't contributed yet, please.
To me, it was interesting.
Some impressions.
Yeah, well, I'm from Hungary, one of the black ships in the EU at the moment. So a lot of this question are happening in my country too. I was actually curious about one thing that I think David mentioned regarding the nuclear plants in the Ukraine that are being built. Who are financing them? Is it the EU or US investors or?
What is it?
Who are financing
The
nuclear plants, because one of the biggest debates in Hungary at the moment too, that we're renewing or expanding one of our nuclear plants, and it's being financed by the Russians, and it's under a contract that's not going to be released for another 50 years or something, and no one knows the terms or what it entails.
I think it's the EU bank that's with the name, but in the past it's been Russia that has provided the reactors for Ukraine, and in Belarus there is also a nuclear plant being built from scratch, which is entirely financed by Russia, which provides the reactors and the fuel, and the whole purpose is to reduce dependency on Russian energy.
I thought you were going to say to reduce Belarus to ashes.
No, but I mean that's the kind of irony that you get.
The EU funding for Ukraine is coming under an instrument for nuclear safety cooperation, and so they're spending 50 million euro just to deal with nuclear waste management and in social projects around the Chernobyl exclusion zone. So that I think they're worried about dealing with preventing disasters that might otherwise develop. And then there's another 36.5 million euro available for further action taken in this area. In terms of energy security, the focus that the EU has taken, and this reflects Slovakia's interests, is in developing interconnectors with reverse flow that will allow Hungary, Slovakia to sell gas back to Ukraine. That Russia sells to the EU, and then they can sell it back to Ukraine to avoid problems of Russia cutting off supply of gas to Ukraine.
Eva?
I was just thinking, there's two researchers, Paulette and Soren. Soren, I believe, is out of the University of Lancaster, who've done quite a bit of work on new public management models within the public sector, and what works, or when it works, the implementation of new public management models within the public sector. And they did a huge meta-analysis of 519 studies, and they found that there is an improvement in countries where there is some corruption. But the results are very mixed. And it kind of speaks to that balance that you were talking about, without kind of throwing out the baby with the bathwater when it comes to the post-secondary education sector and reforms, that yes, there may be needed, but we don't want to, like the humanities going away, and some of the issues that have been plaguing in North America, Australia, UK, with some of the neoliberal reforms. I'm trying to struggle to look at a research question that we might look at, but perhaps one that explores some of the balance as to what needs to be done in terms of the corruption or whatnot. But I think we need to be very careful. And I really like your point about the cultural brokerage, the respect for the values that may not be the same as ours. Values are very difficult to change. And indeed, do we want to change them? Maybe that's the questions we want to ask as well. But Paulette and Saren are two individuals who've done a lot of work on that, which may be useful as a starting point.
Okay.
For those two, look at those two researchers.
Okay, send it to me. I'll circulate it away. Ramona? Yeah?
I guess one of the things I was impressed by, among the many things I was impressed by what was said, but was this contrast of reminding ourselves of what the Soviet system was, centralized land economy, what that meant, the role of the party. It's important to remember that that's what these folks are coming out of, and in many ways large portions of that still exist, and maybe when we are researching and so on, we might try to get some measure of how much of it is still left. Because I think we'd sort of just jump over it and just assume that, well, we're now into reform, and you know, it's kind of a blank slate, and we can just move ahead rapidly and so on. But in fact, I think if we were to find instruments by which we could measure, I don't know, the attitude of people, or for example, the rate of say financial autonomy or decentralization of budgets in the educational system, I think we would find that it's like 85% Soviet. You know, it's not 30% Soviet. It's still very Soviet. But exactly how we express that or measure it and then paint that picture, it would help us then to understand the success and failure.
And if I could just add to that, what might also be interesting is which 15% changed and why, because that's getting at some of the values that where you know, if you take it as a Venn diagram, you see some overlap, or you could also see it as areas where there was resistance. Like, I think that's an important thing, to identify the openness and the resistance, and what are some of the roots of that.
Anything in generational change?
Well, you know, what we do know pretty well is that it takes like 5 to 7 generations for any kind of change in a society. You look at South Africa, you look at Northern Ireland, for you to really be able to see
or even France,
those kinds of changes. Yeah, I mean, we see it historically everywhere. So some of it is intergenerational. Like, that would be interesting to look at attitudes in a way that you could look at it generationally and see if that in fact does show a greater openness among young people.
I think these attitudes and expectations are really important. If you look at in the Commission's analysis, the greatest risk that they point to is that people simply are going to run out of patience, that they're just going to get so dissatisfied because they're not seeing results. And this, I would say that this is the major factor that led to the backsliding that we've seen in Hungary, where people came out transition thinking, great, we're going to see this great improvement in their standard of living and life's going to be great, and they're all supportive of these reforms, which are painful reforms, and then they realize, well, where is this life that I imagined? And because all of the progress that at least the Commission evaluation has identified, these are longer term steps, and they're slow steps, and it's progress which might not immediately be visible, and certainly progress that isn't going to show up in changing the everyday circumstances of your average citizen. And so I think a big question is, what is going to keep the people most broadly, dedicated to this project of continuing democratic reform and pushing for improved governance, and instead of getting lured away by the first promise by an authoritarian leader who'll say, I'll make your life better. And I think it's a real danger.
Yeah. On behalf of the Ukrainians, I have to say informed observers and even politicians are quite aware of this, especially those that are involved in this reform process. They appreciate that they must show results that people can actually have a tangible experience of.
But Putin is equally aware of it, and their goal is just to delay, and hope the Ukrainian public gets so frustrated.
And the tangible is in the form of the tanks.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't know if this ties into that. You know, in some parts of the world, when a major issue happens, one of the things that helps a population survive is knowing that the world is watching. And I wonder if there's some way of exploring the question of how much the Ukrainian diaspora impacts. So Ukrainian diaspora, apparently there's 4 million Ukrainian heritage people living in Russia. There's 1 million apparently living in Canada.
There's more.
There are more. So these are major population groups, and what would their impact be on current reform in Ukraine?
Happily, I'm giving a paper on that very subject. unfortunately, I don't think it's as large as you're imagining. There are all sorts of reasons why. Of course, the first and second generation diaspora people can identify, they come out of that country, can identify, and they can enter into the dialogue. But once you get into third, fourth, fifth generations, they are considered from another planet. They're not Ukrainians anymore, in a real sense. And people get, plus the dollars aren't that big. Like, you know, the diaspora raises millions and millions, but we're talking billions and billions here. And so this diaspora, I wish it were more influential, and maybe there are ways to make it more influential, but so far I'm not persuaded that we're that important.
Another question might be, how do you sustain the energy in the diasporas to do what they're doing, given that the millions can't compete with the billions?
Okay, well, on that note, just looking at the clock, and I don't want to tire everybody out, but thank you very much for your contributions, especially Laurie and David, but everybody else. Thank you for coming and taking part in helping us out. Probably the inner group, the organizing group, will get together and try to pull together the results of this seminar. But thank you very much. From my point of view, very successful. I'm very grateful to everybody for their contributions to this.
And thank you to you for all that you did to make this possible.
Soviet style, the performers applaud the audience.